Miranda Walsh had not planned to reinvent her life at 30, but burnout has a strange way of stripping illusions until only necessity remains. For a decade, she had worked in a glass building filled with screens, graphs, and artificial air, the kind of space where success was measured by the absence of silence. When her father died unexpectedly, leaving behind a modest inheritance and a stack of untouched property deeds in Northern California, she did not make a decision so much as accept an invitation. The vineyard she bought sat at the edge of a low valley, where the air was always slightly cooler and the hills seemed to rise like sleeping giants. There was nothing glamorous about it, no mansion, no grand tasting room, only a small farmhouse and rows of vines that had not been trimmed for years. That neglect suited her. She liked the idea of something imperfect that could still be coaxed into life with patience. In the beginning, everything was quiet. Miranda worked alone, pruning the vines, repairing the old irrigation lines, teaching herself the rhythms of the soil. Her days followed the kind of order that city life never allowed. Dawn in the field, midday in the shed, checking fermentation barrels, sunset on the porch with her notebook. She found herself talking less and listening more, to the wind, the hum of insects, the sound of grapes swelling in the sun. When neighbors stopped by to introduce themselves, she greeted them warmly, but with a reserve she could not fully hide. Most of them were retirees or upper-middle-class professionals who liked the idea of living near the vineyards, though few had ever picked a grape. They belonged to the Homeowners Association, a body that managed everything from street lighting to paint colors. Miranda had nodded politely when they explained it, assuming it was a harmless piece of suburban bureaucracy. She signed a few papers during closing, never imagining that those signatures would later become her undoing. Her first harvest came small but honest. A local restaurant owner tasted her early batch and asked to buy a few cases. For the first time, Miranda felt a spark of pride that wasn't tied to metrics or reports. The wine wasn't perfect. She knew the soil was still too acidic, but it was hers, the product of her hands and mistakes. She spent the winter improving the process, reading late into the night, sketching ideas for a label that would carry her initials and the valley's name. By the time spring came, she had a modest operation, a few barrels, a small bottling setup, and enough customers to justify the long hours. She paid her taxes, filed every permit with the county, and followed each rule with the cautious discipline of someone who had learned not to give systems a reason to notice her. Then, almost imperceptibly, the tone of the neighborhood shifted. The first sign came as a letter on thick paper, printed with the HOA crest. It congratulated her on the success of her agricultural endeavor, but reminded her that commercial activity required review by the board. She reread it twice, unsure what it meant. The property was zoned agricultural. Her operation was legal. She assumed it was a misunderstanding and replied with the necessary documentation. Weeks passed without answer. Then another envelope arrived, this one less congratulatory, more procedural, informing her that her use of the property would be reviewed at the next HOA meeting. She almost laughed. The idea that a handful of retired engineers and real estate agents could dictate what she did with her vines seemed absurd. Still, she attended the meeting, notebook in hand, hoping to clear the confusion. What she found was not confusion, but something colder, an organized politeness that concealed judgment. The board sat in a semicircle at the community center, sipping coffee from identical stainless steel mugs. The president, Wallace Granger, greeted her with a smooth voice that made every sentence sound like a warning wrapped in civility. He praised her initiative, noted her contribution to local charm, and then reminded her that certain communal standards had to be maintained. When she asked what standards those were, he smiled faintly and said, "You'll find out soon enough." It was the kind of phrase that meant nothing and everything at once. That night, Miranda walked home along the narrow road leading to her vineyard, the same road that passed under the HOA's jurisdiction. For the first time since moving there, she noticed the way the streetlights flickered unevenly, how each house seemed to watch her as she passed. The valley no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a stage where she had wandered into the wrong play. She poured herself a glass of her own wine and stared out at the vines glowing silver in the moonlight. Success had never frightened her before, but this kind of success, quiet, self-made, unapproved, seemed to awaken something hostile in the world around her. She could not yet name it, but the first seed of resistance had been planted, and it would grow, like everything else in her vineyard, whether the HOA liked it or not. The first storm arrived not with thunder, but with paperwork. In early May, Miranda received a thick envelope marked Notice of Compliance Review, the kind of bureaucratic title that concealed hostility beneath formality. Inside was a detailed letter from the HOA citing violations she had never heard of: improper boundary maintenance, unauthorized signage, excessive water use, and non-conforming commercial activity. Each line was written with the precision of someone who wanted not resolution, but surrender. The tone was polite, legalistic, and quietly cruel. She read it 3 times before setting it down on the kitchen counter, her pulse quickening with disbelief. She had filed every permit with the county, obtained an agricultural license, and followed every regulation she could find. Yet here was a document implying that her entire livelihood existed on borrowed permission. She drove to the county office the next morning, the envelope on the passenger seat like a silent passenger. The clerk there recognized her. Miranda was one of the few independent vintners in the area, and after a quick search confirmed that her permits were fully valid. Everything was in order. The county had no record of any infractions. When Miranda mentioned the HOA notice, the clerk's expression shifted. That careful mix of sympathy and avoidance reserved for people about to step into a fight they didn't yet understand. Technically, the woman said, lowering her voice, they can't override your state or county permits, but they can make life difficult. Zoning complaints, environmental assessments, nuisance claims. They know how to drain your time. It wasn't advice, just a warning disguised as small talk. Miranda thanked her and left, driving back through the hills, trying to shake off the unease crawling under her skin. The next few weeks unfolded like a slow suffocation. A delivery truck carrying her new fermentation barrels was stopped at the neighborhood gate for 2 hours because the guard had no record of scheduled commercial transport. When she tried to correct the error, the HOA insisted she submit all future deliveries for community review. The same week, a small sign she'd placed by the road, Walsh Vineyards, private property, was removed. When she asked about it, she received a letter stating that unapproved visual installations violated aesthetic ordinances. The irony of being fined for claiming ownership of her own land would have been funny if it hadn't been so absurdly threatening. Gradually, the resistance began to spill beyond paper. At the market, where she sold a few bottles under local vendor exemptions, her table was moved from the central aisle to a dim corner near the exit. The organizer avoided her eyes and muttered something about pressure from the association. Neighbors who had once stopped to chat during morning walks now crossed the street before reaching her gate. A woman she barely knew told her, in a voice trembling with misplaced pity, that Wallace just wants everyone to follow the same rules. Miranda began to realize this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a quiet campaign to isolate her, a kind of social quarantine. Every gesture from the HOA came with the same subtext: you don't belong here. One evening, a notice appeared taped to her mailbox. It bore the HOA's emblem but no signature, only the line, unauthorized business activity may result in forfeiture of privileges. Privileges. The word gnawed at her. Her property was her own, paid for in full, her licenses issued by the state. Yet the phrasing suggested something futile, that her right to exist here was a concession, not a fact. She took the notice down and folded it carefully, forcing herself to remain calm. Anger would make her reckless, and recklessness was what they wanted. She had seen this tactic before, not in neighborhoods, but in corporations. Bureaucracy used as a weapon, authority wrapped in civility. They were pushing her to react, to make a mistake that would justify their hostility. By early summer, her business began to suffer in ways that could not be traced directly, but felt orchestrated. A restaurant that had carried her wine for 2 years suddenly declined to renew their contract, citing supply uncertainty. A local magazine that had profiled her last season quietly deleted the article from its website. The small network of suppliers she relied on started requiring deposits where none had been needed before. It was as if an invisible hand was quietly tightening around her enterprise, not crushing it outright but cutting off its air. Miranda kept working, pruning the vines, tasting the barrels, refusing to show defeat. But she noticed the change in herself. She started counting the cars that slowed near her gate, memorizing the sound of each engine, double-checking every email for tone. The vineyard that had once been her refuge began to feel like a trap with beautiful walls. Then came the letter that changed everything. It arrived without warning, delivered not by mail, but slid under her front door sometime during the night. There was no logo, no address, just her name typed neatly on the front and a single sheet of paper inside. It read, "As of June 15th, your property is subject to review under Community Zoning Revision 14B. Please cease all production until compliance is confirmed." No signature, no contact number, just the cold precision of authority cloaked in anonymity. For the first time, Miranda felt something close to fear. This wasn't a procedural notice. It was a threat disguised as regulation. She walked outside, the paper trembling in her hand, and saw that every mailbox on the street had a new sticker. Zoning adjustment in progress. The entire neighborhood had been reclassified overnight, a bureaucratic maneuver invisible to the public, but devastating to her small operation. She spent that night at her desk, surrounded by open folders, deeds, maps, and county records, tracing the chain of ownership and the boundaries of her land. Somewhere between the lines, she found it. A small amendment filed 6 months earlier by the HOA's legal committee, adjusting the communal boundary to include shared access easements over private agricultural roads. On paper, it looked harmless, a technical correction. In practice, it gave the HOA a legal foothold on her vineyard's driveway and storage lot, just enough to justify interference. The brilliance of it was in its subtlety. They hadn't taken her land. They had simply stepped inside the cracks of her paperwork. By dawn, the sky over the valley had turned the color of unpolished metal. Miranda stood by the window, holding a cup of coffee gone cold, watching the mist slide down the rows of vines. She thought of how quietly this had happened, how no single act seemed illegal or even aggressive, yet together they formed a web too tight to escape. Somewhere in that web sat Wallace Granger, smiling that faint, patient smile, waiting for her to concede. But Miranda felt something harden inside her. They wanted her to react with panic. Instead, she would answer with precision. She didn't yet know how to fight an enemy that hid behind procedures, but she understood the language of systems better than they suspected. The war had begun, not with shouting or violence, but with paperwork, and she would learn to wield it as sharply as they did. The morning she decided to confront the association was heavy, with that strange electrical stillness that comes before a storm. Miranda woke early, the kind of restless dawn where sleep breaks apart from too many unfinished thoughts. The air smelled of dust and copper. The vines were trembling slightly under a wind that hadn't yet found its direction. She had spent the previous week consulting county records, talking to a land use attorney, and piecing together a timeline of the HOA's maneuvers. What she discovered didn't amount to a crime in the traditional sense. It was worse, because it lived in the gray space between legality and manipulation. Each motion they filed, every amendment to their bylaws, had been passed quietly during routine meetings no one thought to attend. On paper, it looked democratic. In practice, it was a quiet coup executed by people who understood how apathy worked. That morning she dressed carefully, choosing the same dark linen shirt she wore when signing her business registration 3 years earlier. There was something ceremonial in the act. She needed to remind herself of what this land meant before walking into a room determined to erase her. The HOA held its meetings in the community recreation hall, a sterile building that looked more like a dentist's waiting room than the heart of neighborhood governance. She arrived early and sat near the back, unnoticed, as members filtered in with their coffee mugs and polite chatter. Wallace Granger entered last, carrying a leather folder that seemed almost theatrical in its weight. He spotted her immediately and offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. When the meeting began, the language was so neutral it almost numbed her. They discussed landscaping budgets, sign repairs, and neighborhood watch initiatives before gliding seamlessly into new business. Item 7. Review of non-compliant property activity. Wallace's voice softened as he read the item aloud, as though trying to ease the room into complicity. We have ongoing concerns regarding the continued operation of a commercial winery within a residential agricultural hybrid zone, he said. This is not punitive. It's simply about maintaining standards. Miranda raised her hand, and after a brief, deliberate pause, he nodded toward her. She stood, her voice steady, but her hands cold. She reminded them that her permits were legal, her boundaries surveyed, her taxes paid. She handed copies of her county certifications to the secretary, who took them without looking up. This isn't a matter of compliance, she said. It's a matter of control. You're rewriting the rules to push people like me out. A murmur rippled through the room, uneasy, defensive. Wallace leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, the picture of calm authority. Ms. Walsh, he replied smoothly, no one is targeting you. We're simply ensuring that our community remains consistent with its founding principles. The phrase hung in the air, vague and menacing. Founding principles. As if the land itself carried an ideology she had violated. By the end of the session, the board voted to impose a temporary suspension of external trade activity, pending further review. The motion passed 6-1. The single dissenting voice, a woman in her 60s named Eleanor Reed, avoided Miranda's gaze as she left the hall, clutching her folder to her chest. Miranda walked out into the blinding sunlight, the decision echoing in her ears like a verdict. On the drive home, she rehearsed what had happened, trying to locate the exact moment the ground shifted beneath her feet. It wasn't the vote itself. It was the silence around it, the way everyone accepted the fiction that procedure made the act fair. Within days, the effects became tangible. A contractor she had hired to repair the fence canceled at the last minute, citing community feedback. A notice appeared at her gate demanding she remove her small storage shed for being architecturally inconsistent. Even the trash service began skipping her pickups. Each act was minor, explainable, deniable, but together they formed a pattern so deliberate it felt choreographed. Miranda documented everything, scanning letters, photographing notes, logging dates and times. The attorney she'd spoken with earlier reviewed her files and sighed. They're not breaking the law, he said. They're bending it until it screams. That's harder to fight. The isolation deepened. Where she had once waved to neighbors on their morning walks, now she was invisible. The silence wasn't passive. It was complicit. Someone had to be coordinating this pressure, and everyone else had decided it was easier to let it happen. One evening, while returning from a supply run, she found 2 HOA vehicles parked along the private road that led to her property. The men inside wore reflective vests, taking notes on clipboards. When she asked what they were doing, one of them replied in a tone so bland it was almost mocking. "Routine maintenance observation, ma'am." She pointed out that it was her private road, part of the vineyard estate, but he simply shrugged and said, "According to the new boundary maps, this section is communal access." That night she spread the documents across her dining table and traced the new boundary lines again. The adjustment was minuscule, 12 feet here, 7 there, but together they carved a corridor of jurisdiction right through her land. It was brilliant in its audacity. They hadn't taken anything outright, but they'd created just enough ambiguity to justify intrusion whenever they pleased. She realized, with a kind of cold clarity, that this was never about wine or zoning. It was about obedience. Wallace wanted to prove that no one could exist in this neighborhood without his permission. A few days later, the pressure took a new form. She received a letter from the regional utility company notifying her of a temporary water service disruption due to unresolved account discrepancies. When she called, the representative sounded uneasy, insisting that the request for suspension had come from the Community Infrastructure Liaison. There was no such title in their system until recently. For 3 days, the taps in her farmhouse ran dry. She carried buckets from the irrigation tanks to the kitchen sink, her anger simmering into something sharper than frustration. It was during those sleepless nights that her resolve crystallized. She would stop reacting defensively. If they wanted a conflict built on documents and procedure, she would fight them in their own language. Late one evening, she drove past the community hall and saw the lights still on. Through the glass, she could see Wallace alone at the podium, speaking softly to someone on a video call. His expression was animated, confident, the kind of face a man wears when he believes himself untouchable. She parked across the street, watching in silence. Something about the way he gestured toward the maps pinned behind him sent a chill through her. He wasn't just enforcing rules. He was negotiating territory, perhaps with investors, perhaps with someone outside the community entirely. The vineyard was not his target. It was a piece of leverage. When she returned home that night, the sky had darkened into the deep indigo that precedes a storm. The vines rustled in the wind like restless witnesses. Miranda stood at the edge of the property, staring at the faint glow of the town in the distance. For the first time, she understood that her struggle was not about belonging, but about survival, of autonomy, of dignity, of truth in a place that worshipped conformity. The first escalation had been declared, not with violence or spectacle, but with precision and intent, and she knew that the next move had to be hers. By midsummer, the rhythm of the vineyard had begun to turn sluggish, not because the grapes grew slower, but because Miranda's attention was constantly divided between tending her fields and fending off invisible blows. The vines, once a source of grounding, now stood as quiet witnesses to a war waged in paperwork and whispers. Every few days brought a new letter printed on the same heavy paper embossed with the HOA's insignia, a symbol that had come to feel like an invasion. One notice claimed she was in violation for having commercial lighting fixtures visible from the main road. Another accused her of soil runoff hazards and threatened environmental fines. Each message arrived with the same precision, as if someone was keeping a schedule of irritation. She learned not to open them immediately. Sometimes she waited until evening, when the valley turned gold and the air cooled enough to soften her anger. Yet no matter how she tried to rationalize or ignore them, each envelope chipped away at the fragile quiet she'd built. It was around this time that Eleanor Reed, the only board member who had voted against the suspension, knocked on her door. She stood awkwardly on the porch, holding a manila folder close to her chest, as if it were contraband. Miranda invited her in, poured coffee, and waited. Eleanor looked tired, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. She had served on the board for 8 years and had seen many of Wallace's tactics, but this was the first time she felt he'd crossed a moral line. "He's not just enforcing regulations," she said quietly. "He's rewriting them. The boundary revisions, the delivery restrictions. He's pushing for a new development proposal that hasn't been made public yet. They want your land to be part of it." Miranda's heart sank. The idea that her vineyard could be targeted for redevelopment sounded insane, but Eleanor's tone carried no trace of exaggeration. She slid the folder across the table. Inside were photocopies of internal memos and meeting notes marked preliminary. The language was bland but chilling. Proposal for community recreation area expansion, potential acquisition of parcels 42A, 46C, preliminary negotiations ongoing. Miranda's property was 44B. For a long moment she couldn't speak. It wasn't about wine anymore. It was about erasure. turning her home into a line item on a profit sheet. She asked why Eleanor was showing her this. The woman sighed, eyes fixed on the floor. Because I can't fight him from the inside. He's got everyone convinced that you're unreasonable. But if you bring this to the county commission yourself, they'll have to investigate. She warned Miranda that doing so would make her a target. He'll come after you harder. He always does. After she left, Miranda sat alone at the kitchen table, the papers spread out like evidence of an invisible crime. Outside, thunder rolled over the hills, and for the first time she allowed herself to feel not just anger, but a strange, resolute calm. There was power in clarity. The following morning, she drove to the county commission office with the folder in her passenger seat. The waiting room smelled of dust and toner. A clerk escorted her to a narrow office where an assistant planner listened politely as she explained her situation. When Miranda laid out the documents, the planner frowned and called for her supervisor. Within an hour, she found herself sitting across from a man named David Renner, a regional compliance officer whose mild demeanor hid a sharp intelligence. He leafed through the memos, his eyes narrowing at certain phrases. "These aren't approved forms," he said finally. "They're drafts, unsigned and unregistered. If he's using these as leverage for zoning proposals, that's a problem." He promised to make some calls and suggested she prepare a formal complaint backed by documentation. "You've done your homework," he added, almost admiringly. "That helps." For a few days things went quiet, which was its own kind of suspense. Miranda continued her work, trying to pretend the calm was real, but she felt the tension humming beneath the surface. On the fourth day, as she was labeling wine bottles in the storage shed, she noticed a black SUV parked near the end of her drive. It sat there for half an hour, engine running, windows tinted so dark she couldn't see who was inside. When she finally approached, the vehicle rolled away slowly, leaving a faint cloud of dust. She didn't recognize the license plate. That night she emailed David, asking whether any officials had been sent to inspect her property. He replied within minutes. "No visits authorized. Be cautious." The message was short, professional, and vaguely alarming. A week later, an inspector did arrive, this time officially. A middle-aged man in a khaki jacket introduced himself as part of the county zoning team. He spoke in short, clipped sentences and carried a digital tablet. At first he seemed indifferent, but as he moved through the property, taking photos and measurements, Miranda sensed something off. He kept referring to her land as shared use space and muttered about pending amendments. When she asked for clarification, he avoided her eyes. Only after he left did she realize he hadn't signed the visitor log and his badge had been missing a county seal. The next day, David confirmed that no inspection had been scheduled. Someone was impersonating county officials. That night, the power went out across the vineyard. It wasn't a storm. It was surgical. Only her property lost electricity, the surrounding homes still glowing under the dark sky. She lit candles and sat by the window, watching the line where her vineyard ended and the HOA managed road began. Somewhere beyond that line, she imagined Wallace, comfortable in his well-lit home, sipping his evening drink and waiting for her to fold. Instead, she opened her laptop, running on battery power, and began drafting her report. She listed every incident, every falsified notice, every interaction. She included photographs, recordings of phone calls, and the internal memos Eleanor had provided. It was meticulous, almost clinical, and by dawn she had something formidable. A legal dossier built with the precision of someone who understood that evidence was the only antidote to lies. 2 days later, she received an email from David. "Your file's been referred to Regional Counsel. Expect contact soon." It was the first sign that the system might actually be turning in her favor. But she knew better than to relax. People like Wallace didn't wait for consequences. They created distractions. Sure enough, within a week, new rumors began circulating in town, that her vineyard's soil was contaminated, that her production used unlicensed chemicals, that she had failed a recent audit. The lies spread quickly, carried by the same neighbors who once smiled at her. At the local store, conversations stopped when she walked in. Someone spray-painted "unsafe for kids" on her front gate. When she called the HOA about the vandalism, she was told to address community concerns privately. The next morning, Eleanor called in a panic. "They're holding a closed meeting tonight," she whispered. "It's about you. He's calling it a disciplinary session." Miranda almost laughed at the absurdity. She wasn't a student, and this wasn't a school, but she knew what he was doing. He wanted to stage a performance, something to turn public perception completely against her before the county could intervene. That evening, as the HOA gathered in the hall, Miranda drove past slowly, but didn't stop. Through the windows, she saw Wallace standing at the podium, animated, gesturing toward a projection screen. Her name appeared in bold letters. She didn't need to hear the words to know their shape: non-compliance, disruption, liability. When she returned home, she found a plain white envelope tucked under her door. Inside was a printed message. "You're making this harder than it has to be. Some of us remember what happens to people who fight the current. Stop before you drown." No signature, no seal, just the clean terror of anonymity. Miranda read it once, twice, and then placed it carefully in a drawer. Fear, she decided, was exactly what they wanted. Instead, she poured herself a glass of her own wine, the one they'd mocked as illegal, and drank it slowly under the weak light of the kitchen lamp. The world outside was collapsing into deceit, but her defiance was becoming methodical, not impulsive. She had evidence, allies she hadn't yet met, and now, for the first time, a glimpse of their strategy. They'd built their power on assumption, on people not questioning the fine print, and she was no longer one of those people. By the end of that week, the county issued an official inquiry into HOA operations, citing potential misconduct and unauthorized zoning activity. Miranda received a copy of the announcement through David, who added only a single line beneath the formal letter: "I told you. It helps when someone finally pays attention." The weight she had carried for months began to shift, but victory still felt distant. What had started as a vineyard dispute had become something larger, a test of who truly governed the land, those who worked it, or those who merely managed its paperwork. As she stood at the edge of her fields that night, the rows glimmering under moonlight, she felt both exhausted and electric. The midpoint of her battle wasn't triumph or defeat. It was revelation. She finally understood the cost of staying silent, and she knew she would never make that mistake again. The county's announcement was supposed to change everything, but instead it only sharpened the hostility. What had been passive obstruction became overt retaliation, and Miranda found herself moving through each day like a soldier navigating mined ground. The HOA didn't try to refute the investigation publicly. They simply redirected their tactics, shifting from open control to quiet sabotage. Trucks delivering her grapes were misrouted, ending up at wrong addresses miles away. Her insurance provider suddenly withdrew coverage, claiming that her risk profile had changed following pending legal disputes. When she asked which disputes they meant, the representative stammered through a script clearly written by someone else. The precision of it all felt almost elegant in its cruelty, like a symphony of small inconveniences designed to exhaust her into surrender. Wallace Granger, as always, stayed untouchably polite. He sent her an email after the county inquiry was announced, its tone sugary and self-assured. "I hope we can all approach this process in a spirit of cooperation," he wrote. "Our community thrives on harmony, and I trust you'll refrain from actions that could damage our shared reputation." It wasn't even a threat, not directly, but the meaning slid beneath the words like a knife. Miranda didn't respond. She knew better than to give him any text that could later be twisted into something else. Silence, she'd learned, could be more strategic than fury. The following week, she noticed that her irrigation lines had stopped working. When she checked the control system, The digital monitor displayed a strange code she hadn't seen before. Remote override active. The manufacturer's technician confirmed that the override could only have been triggered by someone with physical access to the system. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken locks. Someone with authority had entered the property quietly, during daylight hours, and tampered with her equipment. She replaced the locks, installed motion sensors, and changed every access code. Yet the sense of invasion lingered like a stain. The vineyard that had once been her place of solitude now felt compromised, as though the air itself had become complicit. 2 days later, an anonymous complaint appeared on the county's website, accusing her of unsafe storage of flammable materials. It triggered a mandatory inspection from the fire department. 3 uniformed officers arrived unannounced, apologized for the intrusion, and spent nearly an hour checking her equipment. When they found nothing wrong, one of them, a young man with an expression caught between sympathy and disbelief, said quietly, "We've been called here twice this month for the same report. Someone really doesn't want you making wine." He left her his card, suggesting she keep it just in case. That night, Miranda stared at the stack of papers on her desk, each one a different form of harassment, and understood that she was no longer just fighting to keep her vineyard. She was fighting for the right to exist without permission. The investigation into Wallace's activities advanced slowly, mired in procedural delays. He was clever enough to hide behind layers of compliance and delegation, claiming that every questionable action had been approved by committee vote. Yet small cracks began to show. An accountant who had handled HOA finances resigned suddenly, citing ethical concerns. A planning consultant attached to the redevelopment project withdrew his proposal, claiming he had been misled about property boundaries. These were minor tremors, but Miranda felt them as confirmation that her persistence was working. She didn't need to win yet. She just needed the structure of his authority to start wobbling. Then, one humid afternoon in late August, the real blow landed. She received a formal cease and desist letter, not from the HOA but from a private law firm representing a group of concerned residents. The claim alleged that her vineyard was releasing chemical runoff into the communal drainage system, endangering public health. The document was 20 pages long, dense with citations and pseudoscientific jargon. The irony was that her vineyard didn't use chemical pesticides at all. She had built her production around organic methods. It didn't matter. The accusation was enough to trigger a provisional shutdown order while environmental samples were tested. Her tanks had to be sealed, her distribution halted, her contracts suspended. Overnight, months of work were frozen by a single fraudulent allegation. She spent the next 72 hours calling lawyers, environmental agencies, and the county office. Everyone expressed sympathy, but moved with bureaucratic slowness. The tests would take weeks. Her barrels sat untouched in the cellar, each one a reminder of how power could ruin without touching. On the 3rd night, she found herself walking through the vines under a crescent moon, trying to breathe through the panic. The air was thick with ripening fruit, and the faint metallic scent of water drifting from the irrigation channels. Somewhere nearby, she heard the distant hum of a generator. It was coming from the direction of the community maintenance shed, a facility technically under HOA control. She followed the sound, her steps light on the gravel, and when she reached the chain-link fence, she saw 2 figures inside, working by flashlight. One was Wallace. The other was a man she didn't recognize. They were unloading sealed containers into a trench behind the shed, containers marked with hazardous waste symbols. For several long seconds she stood there frozen, the realization expanding in her chest like a slow explosion. The runoff accusation hadn't been a coincidence. It was projection, a classic deflection. Accuse someone else of the crime you're committing. The contamination wasn't from her vineyard. It was from them. She backed away quietly, heart hammering, and drove home without headlights until she reached her gate. Inside the house, she wrote down everything she had seen, recording the exact time and location. But she also knew that reporting it without proof would only make her look desperate. She needed evidence, and that meant waiting. 2 nights later, she returned to the site just before dawn, carrying a small camera and a flashlight. The trench was half filled now, covered with loose soil. She dug for 10 minutes before striking metal, the corner of one of the containers. The label was smeared, but the barcode was intact. She photographed everything and sent the files to David with a brief message. Found source of contamination. Confirm origin? His reply came hours later. Those cereals belong to a landscaping supplier contracted by HOA. This is serious. Stay cautious. The phrasing made her skin crawl. He didn't say call the police, which told her everything she needed to know about how deeply this might reach. By the end of that week, a county enforcement unit arrived quietly, this time with real authority. They sealed the maintenance site, confiscated the containers, and took soil samples. No one spoke openly about what they'd found, but rumors spread fast about illegal dumping, falsified safety audits, and a mismanagement investigation targeting Wallace's leadership. The HOA issued a sterile statement insisting on full cooperation, yet the panic beneath the professionalism was palpable. For the first time, the balance of fear shifted. Miranda could feel it in the way people looked at her when she passed through town, not as an outcast anymore, but as someone they'd underestimated. That night, as rain began to fall over the valley, she sat on the porch watching the rows of vines shimmer under lightning flashes. The vineyard was silent, except for the slow drip of water from the eaves. She thought about how fragile everything had seemed only weeks ago, how every attack had been designed to make her small, invisible, compliant. Now the same system that had tried to erase her was cracking under its own arrogance. She didn't smile or celebrate. She knew this wasn't over. People like Wallace didn't collapse. They retaliated. Still, there was a quiet satisfaction in the air, a recognition that she had survived the part designed to break her. The second escalation had revealed the truth behind the war. It was never about land, or vines, or rules. It was about the illusion of control, and the moment you stopped believing in it, their power began to rot. The storm that broke over the valley that September felt like a culmination, the sky itself cracking open as if to release months of tension that had been building in silence. The investigation into the HOA had grown teeth. What began as a quiet administrative audit now drew the attention of the county district office. Wallace's veneer of composure started to splinter in public. Subtle at first, a hesitation during a meeting, a rare lapse in his perfect diction, but soon his calm decayed into visible strain. Rumors spread that the hazardous waste found on association property matched the kind used in landscaping projects he personally approved. Contractors began denying involvement, and 2 board members abruptly resigned, citing irreconcilable differences. For weeks, the air around the neighborhood vibrated with tension so dense it felt physical, like static clinging to skin. Miranda kept working quietly, pruning her vines and sending documents when requested, refusing to feed the hysteria. She knew the trap of public outrage. It burned fast, then left you empty. Patience was her weapon now. One morning, she received a formal subpoena to testify at a hearing regarding zoning misconduct and environmental violations. It was to be held in the county's old courthouse, a modest building with peeling paint and a clock that had stopped years ago. She drove there alone, the roads slick from rain, her hands steady on the wheel despite the pounding in her chest. The hearing was administrative, not criminal, at least not yet, but it carried the gravity of something irreversible. When she entered the courtroom, she saw Wallace already seated at the table opposite hers, surrounded by 2 lawyers who looked like they had stepped out of a corporate catalog. He greeted her with a thin smile, the same performative politeness that had always disguised his contempt. She nodded once, acknowledging him without emotion, and sat beside the county counsel who whispered, "Just tell the truth. The rest is already crumbling." The proceedings began with the slow rhythm of bureaucracy, sworn statements, document verifications, procedural clarifications, but beneath the formalities, there was an undercurrent of collapse. Evidence was presented. Copies of internal HOA emails, falsified zoning maps, financial ledgers showing unapproved transactions labeled as community improvements. Then came the photographs of the buried containers. The moment they were projected on the screen, a ripple moved through the room. Wallace's jaw tightened, his hand twitching once against the table before he stilled it. The county investigator explained how the serial numbers matched shipments paid for through the HOA's discretionary fund, funds that had been withdrawn in cash. When Miranda was called to speak, she felt the weight of every sleepless night gather in her chest, not as fear, but as something like clarity. She described the sequence of events in detail, the letters, the boundary adjustments, the impersonated inspections, the sabotage. Her voice didn't tremble. The words came measured and deliberate, as though each sentence had been fermented in patience, aged until it lost bitterness and gained strength. Wallace's attorney tried to discredit her, implying that she had interpreted administrative errors as malice. But the attempt fell flat when the investigator produced a series of bank transfers connecting Wallace to a shell landscaping company, the same name stamped on the hazardous waste barrels. The room went silent, except for the sound of rain tapping against the windows. The chairwoman of the board asked Wallace directly whether he had authorized the payments. For the first time, his voice faltered. "We acted in the community's best interest," he said, the phrase cracking halfway through. Certain logistical decisions were delegated, but he didn't finish. The attorney leaned in, whispering something that made him pale. In that instant, Miranda saw not the tyrant who had dominated her life for months, but a man watching the walls close in, trying desperately to maintain a posture that no longer fit his reality. When the hearing adjourned, the outcome was clear, though not yet official. The HOA was to be placed under state review, its authority suspended pending criminal investigation. Wallace left without meeting anyone's eyes. His carefully curated empire of order had collapsed into the same chaos he'd used to control others. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the courthouse steps glistened like silver glass. Miranda stood there for a long moment, breathing in air that tasted sharper than before, as if the storm had washed the valley clean. She knew the fight wasn't finished. The paperwork would drag on, the fines would take months, and there would always be those who whispered that she had ruined the community. But she also knew something fundamental had shifted. The fear that had lived beneath her skin for months was gone, replaced by an almost dangerous calm. A week later, county officials arrived to formally seal the HOA office. Trucks came to remove boxes of documents, their headlights cutting through the fog of early morning. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, watching in uneasy silence. No one spoke to her, but a few nodded faintly when she passed. The gesture wasn't quite apology, not yet, but it was acknowledgement, and that was enough. That evening she walked the vineyard with a lantern, tracing the rows of grapes heavy with ripeness, each vine alive with the faint shimmer of post-rain mist. The land felt different now, not safer exactly, but honest again. When she reached the edge of her property, she looked toward the dark outline of the empty HOA building across the road. The windows reflected the light of her lantern back at her like eyes that could no longer see. She stood there until the flame began to waver, the night settling into quiet. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel like warning. It felt like peace earned, fragile and real, the kind that comes only after everything false has been stripped away. When autumn settled across the valley, it came not with celebration, but with a deep, steady quiet that felt like the exhale after too long holding one's breath. The investigation into the HOA continued, dragging through layers of legal formality, but its power was gone, dispersed like smoke after a fire. Wallace Granger was officially removed from his position, pending charges that grew heavier with each week of discovery. The association that once dictated every blade of grass now existed only as a shell, its meetings canceled, its bank accounts frozen, its members cautious and strangely polite when passing one another on the road. The fear that had once governed the neighborhood had dissolved into embarrassment. that peculiar shame of people who realize too late that they have followed the wrong voice. Miranda did not gloat. She had no appetite for triumph. Exhaustion had replaced anger, and what she wanted most was to return to the simplicity that had brought her here in the first place. The vineyard survived, though it bore the marks of its siege: patches of neglected vines, a few barrels lost to spoilage, months of work undone by bureaucratic warfare. Yet as she walked the rows in the soft amber light of late afternoon, she saw new growth pushing through the older stems. Nature, at least, had no interest in politics. The county reinstated her agricultural permits in full and granted her exemption from future HOA oversight, acknowledging that her property had been wrongfully annexed. A small notice appeared in the local paper, dry and factual, confirming the end of the matter. That brief paragraph, tucked between advertisements for yard sales and dental clinics, carried the weight of everything she had endured. Neighbors began to stop by again, cautiously at first, carrying apologies disguised as conversation. A man who had once voted against her offered to help repair her fence. A woman brought fresh bread just because. Miranda accepted their gestures without bitterness. She understood that most people did not act out of cruelty, but out of fear of standing alone. She had learned what that isolation felt like, how it eroded certainty and warped truth. The lesson had carved something permanent in her, a refusal to let silence dictate what was right. By November, the vineyard's rhythm returned. The wine from the previous harvest had aged beautifully despite the chaos, carrying a subtle sharpness she hadn't tasted before, as if the struggle itself had seeped into its character. She bottled it under a new label, Perseverance Valley. When she poured the first glass one evening, sitting on the porch as the sun dissolved into the hills, she realized she no longer associated the land with fear. It had become something purer, a testament to endurance, to the stubborn belief that integrity could survive even the most organized cruelty. The HOA building across the road remained empty, its windows boarded and its sign removed. Sometimes she caught herself glancing toward it, not with resentment, but with quiet understanding. It stood as a monument to what power looked like when built on deceit, grand for a while, then hollow. The community, stripped of its hierarchy, slowly began to breathe differently. Rules softened, voices reemerged, and people learned, in small, hesitant steps, how to manage their own affairs without a dictator disguised as a neighbor. When winter arrived, Miranda threw a small gathering in her cellar, inviting those who had stood by her and those who had once turned away. They drank, laughed uneasily at old memories, and for the first time, the room felt free of tension. As she watched them, Miranda realized that victory wasn't in the exposure of Wallace or the collapse of the HOA. It was in this quiet reclamation of normal life. She had defended her vineyard, yes, but more than that, she had reclaimed the simple right to live without permission. The vines outside, bare now but waiting for spring, seemed to echo that truth. Survival was never loud. It was slow, deliberate, and once earned, unbreakable.